I speak,
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to reinforce the comments that were made by my colleague Kelvin Davis around this bill and Labour's support for it. And do just want to acknowledge that obviously the system surrounding offender and prisoner management does need amendment and updating. It is, of course, more than unfortunate that the proof and demonstration that we had of the need to update our legislation was, of course, quite a serious breach of the law, but the ability of a prisoner to escape not only from prison but from New Zealand, you can't really get much more serious than that. But what I think we need to remember, though, Mr. Speaker, is that although we now know that there are a number of things that did not protect or prevent a prisoner from making an escape like that, while there were a number of things that weren't in place to do that, actually there were some really basic failings that occurred that meant we should never have seen some of those mechanisms tested. So what do I mean by that? Well, sure, we know that, for instance, there are no comprehensive systems in place where internal affairs are routinely supplied with information about New Zealanders' citizens who are not allowed to leave the country. So we also know Customs was not routinely loading information about those not allowed to leave the country into its border alert system. So two obvious things we need to make sure are happening now. But actually, before Philip John Smith even arrived at the airport, there are a number of things that should have happened that never happened. Like, for instance, he was being released to a nominated sponsor. He had been part of a release, I guess, training run that we use in our correction system. So he was due to be released to a sponsor, but no one informed the nominated sponsor of his pending release. So therefore, there was no expectation that he would arrive by that sponsor and no call to corrections when that individual did not arrive. So yes, we have some failings at our border, yes, but actually some of those failings, those fundamental failings, occurred right at the beginning and were failings within the correction system of the most basic nature. Now, of course, corrections have, and I acknowledge, responded quite quickly to that and acknowledged those failings. One of the concerns I think we need to have, though, is that things like work to release, which is by and large a really well-run, well-utilised way of slowly working towards reintegration while a prisoner is still behind the prison wall, but they're getting close to the point at which they'll be released. They're assessed as being ready for work, being work ready and being in a situation where corrections feel able to monitor them outside the wall for work. Then those prisoners are able to go out and do that and then come back into the prison grounds in the evening. Now, work to release, by and large, works really well. But because my understanding is that as a consequence of some of these issues by Philip that were raised by Philip John Smith, we had a complete shutdown on work to release. And that's a real shame because actually, when used well, when monitored well, when we do a proper risk analysis of the individuals who it applies to, it works. It's a good tool. So we don't want to see a complete knee-jerk reaction. And I would implore the Minister to check with correction, to work with corrections to make sure we get some of those useful tools back into play. But I want to come to what the bill fundamentally does for Customs, Excise Act, Birth, Deaths and Marriages, the Privacy Act across the board, around the way that biometric information is used at the border. And as I say, Labor supports this bill, but we do want to check some of the parameters of it once it gets before Select Committee. Best example of some of the things that we want to have a bit of a discussion around is the way that biometric information will be used, for instance, by Customs. So when we're referring to biometric information, immigration obviously uses biometric information already. It includes basically the ability to scan the iris, photographs and fingerprints, not necessarily all of them, but that's the cohort that we describe as biometric information. Now, in New Zealand, when you apply for a passport, we don't automatically provide all of that information. Obviously, we provide a photograph, but some of that additional information is really kind of checked on a voluntary basis at the return into New Zealand. So as a New Zealander, when I exit New Zealand, the only information that is used for me is a photo. But if we use, as I understand it, if you opt to use the e-gates, then you're providing greater information at the border. Now, one of the things that this bill will allow, if we come to, say, for example, Subpart 2 of the Customs and Excise Act, if you get down to the amendments that this bill will make, it allows biometric information, which, as I have mentioned, is one or more of the following kinds of information: a photograph, impressions of the person's fingerprints, a scan of the person's irises. And then we go on to 32D. It talks about how that information can then legally be used, and it states, Customs may, for the purposes of monitoring the movement of craft and persons, passenger and crew processing, and border security, collect and use the following information about craft and persons arriving in or departing from New Zealand. A, details of craft movements, that's less useful. B, personal information including the person's name, date of birth, gender, biometric information, passport number, nationality, and travel movements. It then goes on to 32E and states a customs officer may, during the processing of a person's arrival in or departure from New Zealand, request that person to verify his or her identity by providing biometric information. It then has a series of provisions around what happens if you fail to do that. Now, those are quite broad sweeping provisions. At the moment, we're basically allowing customs to, at their discretion, access or request biometric information for anyone who arrives or departs. Now, I want to point out again that that's actually not commonly what's practiced, other than a photo, that they are currently not able to do that with everyone who comes and goes. And look, it may be the will of the House that we consider that to be absolutely fine to broaden that power, because actually the status quo provides some powers for entry but not for departure, and this is obviously where our concern exists around the people who are seeking to depart from New Zealand and not just arrive. And so it may well be that we want those broad sweeping powers to be available to border control. But that's a discussion we need to have, because in the regulatory impact assessment, it has acknowledged that they've actually said, look, our preferred option is not to check every single person at departure, but to allow the discretion. Well, actually, and allow the discretion, is that enough to make sure that we pick up everyone who might have a false passport or be using an alternate identity? So there's arguments on both sides. We really need to test that we've got the balance right in the powers that we're handing over at the border to border security and to customs. One other point that I wanted to make, Mr. Speaker, is that with these kinds of bills, it's always incumbent on us as the opposition to make sure that we do look at every implication. As I've said, we support the bill. The intent of it is absolutely necessary. But as a House, it's really important that we also make sure that we look at the Bill of Rights implications. Look, sometimes we do pass in this House things that do encroach on individuals' privacy. It's always our job to check that that's done in a proportionate way, and that we have analysed, we know the implications, and that we are comfortable with a breach if a breach indeed has occurred. I try and make a habit of checking a Section 7, a Bill of Rights assessment against legislation like this. I have not been able to find the BORA analysis for this bill. We checked online today. It does not seem to be available. I personally think that's unacceptable for a bill that does undertake some of the functions that this one does. So I make a plea of the government, if indeed a BORA has been undertaken, which I can only assume it has. Unfortunately, the documents that the departmental disclosure statement made it very clear that it wasn't available at the time that that was drafted. I would implore the government, make that available to the opposition. We cannot do our job without information like that. Otherwise, Mr Speaker, I look forward to the scrutiny that I know Select Committee will be able to provide to this bill to ensure that we absolutely get the balance right.